welcome to the Jonathan Edwards podcast, a podcast brought to you by the Jonathan Edwards Center at Gateway Seminary. My name is Dr. Chris Woznicki, and I have the privilege of being the research fellow at the Jonathan Edwards Center, or as I'd like to call it, the JEC. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the JEC, it is one of 10 international affiliate centers of the Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale University. Here at Gateway, we strive to be the educational epicenter for researching the life and works of America's premier theologian. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by strengthening our existing doctoral programs, by networking with international scholarly communities and churches, and finally, we do that by hosting this podcast. In these episodes, we get to talk to premier Jonathan Edwards scholars about their cutting-edge work. We'll also get the opportunity to dive into some of Edwards' most famous works. And most importantly, we'll get to chat about why any of this matters. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Obbie Tyler Todd. So some of our audience will know who you are if they are active on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days. But for those who might not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and I guess what brought you to Gateway this week?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm here because I was invited by Chris Chun to lecture and to preach in chapel today. So I preached from Exodus 13 in the pillar of cloud and fire, and I was able to lecture on the history of Jonathan Edwards and Southern Baptists from the 19th century to the present day. And so it was really just a quick whistle-stop tour on how Baptists have interacted with Edwards throughout American religious history.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about maybe your background studying Edwards, what you currently do, I guess some of your current interests in history.
Okay. I'm the pastor at Third Baptist Church of Marion, Illinois, and I'm an adjunct professor online and for Luther Rice, where I teach theology, and then I teach a little bit of adjunct at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, which is my alma mater, and I teach some church history there. My doctoral road was weird. It's not one that was very conventional, and it's not one that I would really recommend. I did my MDiv and my THM at Southern Seminary and did my PhD at New Orleans. I was pretty much the only one who cared anything about Jonathan Edwards while I was there. Once I left, I'm not sure there's anyone that cares about him now. I would say that the one redeeming thing about my doctoral experience, and that's not to take anything away from people at New Orleans, they just had other interests. The one redeeming thing about my doctoral experience was the fact that they kind of gave me free rein just to kind of go dig around and research. And so they were like, Obbie, what do you want to study? And I was like, Edwards. They're like, okay. So I got my idea from Tom Nettles at Southern Seminary, and so I ended up studying Jonathan Edwards' legacy more than his theology. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of how I got my road started. So
tell us, how did you, I guess, first get interested in Edwards? You mentioned Dr. Tom Nettles, and at what point did you get? Oftentimes people start out being interested in Edwards in a sort of pastoral or spiritual classics kind of way, and then they get into him in an academic sense. How did you get introduced to Edwards? How did you get pulled into the academic orbit?
That's kind of how it was for me. Tom Nettles, I took his class on the theology of Jonathan Edwards as a THM student, and man, I was hooked. I think I first read Ian Murray's biography of Edwards. It is hagiography, but man, it was so compelling. I just remember gobbling that book up. In fact, it changed my after reading it. I think it was in my MDiv, and after I read it, I changed my focus for my THM to historical theology instead of New Testament. And so then, like you just said, after I read Ian Murray, then I was reading books like George Marsden's biography and then reading Doug Sweeney. And before I knew it, I was hooked. And so I took 2 classes from Dr. Nettles on Jonathan Edwards. So he was very formative for me. And before you knew it, I was reading Nature of True Virtue. I was reading The End for Which God Created the World, and So it was his devotional works, I'd say, that pulled me in, his revival narratives and so forth. And then I kind of worked my way into his sermons and some of his metaphysical works.
So you mentioned kind of your journey taking you from Southern and then New Orleans. Some of our listeners might be considering doing a PhD on Edwards here at Gateway or maybe some other seminary context. What advice would you give to someone who did a PhD on Edwards in a seminary context to those who might be considering going that same route, or maybe even just doing Edwards as a PhD subject in general?
My advice, and this is just one piece of advice, it's what worked for me. I came to Tom Nettles when I was at the end of my THM in Louisville, Kentucky, and I said, I want to study Edwards. And of course, like any good supervisor or scholar, he said, which part of Edwards? And I was like, well, I don't know, his life. And it's then that I think I started to realize that, man, I think for the last 20 or 30 years, we've really seen this blossoming of Edwards studies. And I quickly realized that I really needed to think more deeply about which facet of his thinking. And so my suggestion for those wanting to maybe study the theology or the thought of Jonathan Edwards would be to try to think about his tradition and his legacy and his disciples. That's really what my dissertation was about. Tom Nettles suggested that I learn about Edwards and his thought, and then go and look at maybe some of the thinkers and figures in history that he had influenced. So, and that really appealed to me because now I get to learn about Edwards, and then I get to learn about the history and the transmission of ideas. Mm-hmm. For me, it was the ideas of Edwards and how different people, different traditions, different groups were taking those same ideas and playing around with them. And so I was fascinated with even how the New Divinity seemed to disagree on certain points with Edwards, and sometimes even taking some of his ideas and making new doctrines and thinking that they were consistent with Edwards when maybe they weren't. And so if I had to suggest anything to students today, it would be do historical theology, and it would force you, if you're to do historical theology, it's going to force you to do theology well and to study Edwards, but the benefit would be in seeing how Edwards's theology shaped generations of Christians in multiple theological traditions.
So this is something we were talking about earlier, the importance of doing history well, so historiography, and how different the field of theology is, and how sometimes those two fields kind of blur. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they don't play all that well with one another. What would you say, as somebody who kind of navigates both spaces, how to do theology well with a historical mindset, and then how to do history well while reading texts theologically?
I feel like you and I feel like the latest generation of Edwards scholars have been shaped. I feel like there's Ken Minkema, who's like the godfather. It's like anytime anyone has a question, it's like, let's go email Dr. Minkema. But I feel like in terms of scholarship and actually pumping out papers, books, chapters, I feel like I was shaped chiefly by Oliver Crisp and Doug Sweeney. After Jonathan Edwards, that book, that black book, man, after I read that book, I was like, this is me. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was that book. Every time I pull it off my shelf, I'm like, I remember when I read these pages. I mean, I know you have a book that's like that. And I see you, I mean, you studied under Crisp. I mean, you're a Crispian. You obviously might disagree with Crisp on certain things, but you're an analytic guy. I see you kind of taking that, and Edwards invites this kind of diversity within within the community of scholars, because there's guys who are really digging down deep into his metaphysics or his ethics, and kind of piecing out portions of his thought, because of course he's a philosopher. He's not just a theologian. Mm-hmm. He's someone who takes ideas, and he was, I think, was it Sidney Alstrom? It called him the apostle to the Enlightenment. Somebody called him that. It's one of my favorites. So I see me being more, even though I was influenced by both men, I see me in my scholarship being more Doug Sweeney. Mm-hmm. So I think there's, and of course, both those men edited after Jonathan Edwards.
Right.
And so to get back to your question, I think that the way to balance it would be, you have to know theology to even study Jonathan Edwards. Because if you don't read his works and you don't understand theology, you don't understand Edwards.
Yeah.
But I think the historian also understands that as enlightened and as brilliant as Edwards was, he was in so many ways a man of his time. I mean, he was a Puritan. He was a product of the Enlightenment. He was a grandson of Solomon Stoddard. He was, he read John Locke. These things. So I think a way to do that would be to read Edwards's life before you read Edwards's works. You might contend maybe it's the other way around. But I think a good way that I would like to do history is reading that person's life and then digging down deeper into their thought. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I would approach balancing theology and history. Is a theologian should never stray too far from biography. Mm. I just don't think they have you just cannot. If you're going to deal with any kind of historical theology, you don't need to read just edited volumes. Eventually, you've got to get down to primary sources and biographies and men like George Marsden who really take us to the heart of who this man is. Yeah. I mean, Marsden doesn't just give us an intellectual biography. He gives us a portrait of Edwards.
Yeah, no, he really does. Yeah, so and that's a good word and a good reminder. I think that's shaped some of obviously it's shaped your own work, and it's shaped some of the work that we're going to talk about right now. So you recently, maybe not that recently, I think recent within like 5 years or so, as opposed to like 150, 200 years. That's my category for recent. Published a book titled Southern Edwardseans, The Southern Baptist Legacy of Jonathan Edwards. And I think it's a really important book for Southern Baptists, obviously, but for Baptists in general. So if you have some extra birthday money, I would say, or Christmas money, because that's coming just around the corner from when we're recording this.
You'll probably need both to afford it.
Yeah, you'll probably need both. If you don't have that extra money, you can have your school library order a copy of this book. So before we dive into the content a little bit, tell us, why did you decide to write this particular book?
Well, it's because I started writing my dissertation on Richard Furman, who I knew was influenced by Edwards. I didn't know how deeply. And as I was writing on Furman's Doctrine of Atonement, because I was starting to see that he kind of played around with really two theories at once, I started to notice that his circle of friends, Basil Manley Sr., Jonathan Maxey, W.T. Brantley, so on, all of these men were reading Edwards too. And traditionally in Edwards' historiography, I think we've seen how Edwards pushed west. Charles Finney, Lyman Beecher. We've seen the Middle Atlantic states, like for instance, Edwards himself was in New Jersey as the president. We've seen how the burned over district in the Second Great Awakening, a lot of them were Edwardseans. And we've also seen how he's affected more than just New England Congregationalism. The Presbyterians, they really liked Edwards. And of course, by the time you get to Charles Hodge, maybe less. But the point being, I saw a gap where the legacy of Edwards amongst Baptists, and especially Baptists in the South, was just a gaping hole. Traditionally, it's been understood that Edwards's ideas did not cross the Mason-Dixon line. And it's also been understood that since Edwards didn't think too highly of Baptists during his lifetime, that he didn't really have much of a legacy amongst Baptists in the generations to come. And that just wasn't true. So I saw that, well, in fact, Edwards had a huge influence upon not only the South, but Baptists in the South, Baptists in the West. And since that's my theological tradition, I was like, these are my people. Mm-hmm. Very flawed people, slave-owning people at times. And so that just made it even more juicy to me, because that's like, okay, wait a minute, I thought the New Divinity were abolitionists. So now you've got people who take the theology of abolitionists and use it to support their slave owning. I mean, maybe sometimes not explicitly, but it just shows how malleable ideas are, how they can change over time. And anyway, I thought to myself, okay, well, Edwards said a lot of Baptist things during his life. He was one who did not like the halfway covenant. I mean, he really believed that a church should be for Christians, not half Christians. That's a Baptist thing. But at the same time, he supported things like the Saybrook platform, which basically got rid of local church autonomy. So you see Baptistic things in his thought, but you also see that he was, he had things about him that didn't seem to appeal to Baptists, but others that did. So this just really just drew me in, and that's kind of how I got started on it. And the more I dug into antebellum Baptist history, I found that there was just a whole plethora of Baptist figures who loved Edwards, read about Edwards, and talked about Edwards.
So as you read them, did they ever address the fact that Edwards wasn't all that positive on Baptists?
They never really do. They did talk about his stand against the halfway covenant. They really cited that and used that in their they even talked about that controversy. They never really talk about how Edwards kind of resisted Baptists during his life. I think to Baptists, what mattered most to Edwards was his heartfelt religion, his emphasis upon the affections, his love of revival. That just appealed to them. And to a people who are in the midst of the Second Great Awakening, they see Edwards's religion of the heart and his piety and his devotion, and sometimes his metaphysical works, like the end for which God created the world. They see those things and they are like, this is written to me. And so Edwards captures a denomination that he had no business dealing with in his lifetime, and in a place where he never went. So no, they never really address that. I think they maybe someone like the Northern Baptists who maybe suffered some persecution at the hands of Congregationalists, but in the South, in the Southern Baptist world, they really never addressed Edwards' views.
So in the book, you mentioned 4 distinct ways that Edwards had influence on Southern Baptists. So obviously him holding firm opinions about Baptists, although not always necessarily negative. He has some kind things to say about Gill's
That's right.
views on predestination. And of course, Southern Baptists, as we know them, didn't exist in Edwards' day. But what are the ways that his ideas played out in Baptist theology? And what are those four different ways?
Sure. Well, the first way was that basically what the 4 ways that I talk about that he influenced Baptists were what do I call it? Simple Edwardseanism, which is just Baptists who read Edwards directly. New Divinity Edwardseanism, which is Baptists who, to a lesser extent, were influenced by his successors. Fullerite Edwardseanism, which was probably one of the most dominant, which was through Andrew Fuller. And then what I call implicit Edwardseanism, which is just Edwards' ideas were so pervasive and things like revival narrative and life of David Brainerd. Sometimes Baptists were just ingesting Edwards and didn't even really know it. But I would say one of the key ways that you see Edwards' ideas really taking root in the Baptist tradition is freedom of the will. His arguments about natural ability, moral necessity, that stuff just comes up time and time again amongst Baptists. Sometimes, I mean, like Basil Manley Sr., you read one of his sermons, and, I mean, it's almost like he's cutting and pasting from Freedom of the Will. If you read John Dagg's Manual of Theology, which is the first systematic theology ever penned by a Southern Baptist, he doesn't cite Edwards by name, but he really doesn't have to. I mean, there's things he says about love to being in general when you're like, this is coming straight from Edwards. And
if you don't know Edwards, you'd have no idea.
That's right. And so I think that's another reason this book was not written until a couple years ago, because you have to know the theology of Edwards, you have to know the theology of Edwards' successors, and you have to know Baptist theology, and oftentimes they're the same. And so they take freedom of the will. They love natural and moral ability, because that, of course, appeals to them as revivalists. There's a strong emphasis upon human responsibility, and there always has been in Southern Baptist life. There's, in terms of ideas, what's another idea that they loved? They love disinterested benevolence, which Edwards does use. Of course, Samuel Hopkins, his disciple, is the one who really kind of takes it in another direction and popularizes it. But you just see a whole host of ideas, affections, religious affections. Baptists take hold of this because they are not, although some people like to think that their history is, Southern Baptists really not until the days of James P. Boyce, Southern Baptists were just not high confessional Baptists. They just weren't. They were moderate Calvinists. And so you could say that early Southern Baptists were, unlike Methodists, they had just enough Calvinism to like Edwards, and unlike Presbyterians, they weren't strict confessionalists. And so that just created this great, perfect recipe for affectionate, heartfelt, pious, evangelical Calvinism, and that's exactly what Edwards' writings offered them. And so from that perspective, it's really no surprise at all that Baptists would latch a hold to his ideas.
Yeah. So related to this particular book, you also had an essay titled Edwards with a Southern Accent, which readers can find on the Desiring God website.
I'm really proud of that title, by the way.
There's some really fun Edwards essay titles, even in that book that we both contributed to, the one edited by John Lowe, Edwards and the Enlightenment. There were a couple in there that are pretty bomb titles, but yeah, that is a really good title. So readers can find it on the Desiring God website. It's not a typical Desiring God kind of article. It's a full on. You got footnotes. It's well researched. It is an academic article.
It's in their series that they call feature articles. They have 2 a month, I think, and I don't have a relationship with Desiring God where I just send in stuff and they publish it. I'm not sure others may have another relationship to them, but I know the guys at Desiring God usually contact me with an idea, and in this case, David Mathis at Desiring God was like, "So Edwards in the South." Mm-hmm. I like it.
Yeah.
Let's spin this. So, to your point, it's not a typical one, but I think they usually allow for maybe 2 articles a month, 2 or 3, that are more like journal articles, and they tell you to write it like that. And so Desiring God guys, being in the vein of Piper, love them some Edwards. And ironically, John Piper was born in Greenville, South Carolina, which is not far from the birthplace of Southern Edwardsianism. It was just a natural fit, and I'm glad they asked me to write it.
Yeah. So I'd definitely recommend that article. It's not your typical blog. It's an actual research essay. So in this article, you mentioned that Edwards wasn't highly regarded, let me see if I get it correctly, by slaveholders, especially Southern Presbyterians. How did they express their disapproval, and why did they disapprove of his theology?
Man, that's I feel like we could do like two podcasts on that question. I have put it like this, and I have to make this statement so that I can make some others. Just because you supported Edwards did not mean that you were anti-slavery, like, the New Divinity. And even I think scholars like Doug Sweeney have said that, even the New Divinity at times were rather moderate abolitionists. But strong anti-slavery sentiment strong pro-slavery sentiment in the antebellum South very often overlapped with a strong opposition to Edwards's theology. And that's significant. Some of the most outspoken voices for the Confederacy and some of the most outspoken voices in defense of slavery coincided and were the same voices that were critiquing Edwards. And I think that is not a coincidence. Robert Louis Dabney was a well-known Southern Presbyterian theologian from Virginia. Many people today know him as just the Presbyterian theologian in the South, but others would know that he was also the chief of staff for Stonewall Jackson, who was also a Presbyterian. And Dabney loved him some slavery. And Dabney had a range of critiques from Edwards. Sean Michael Lucas, who's a Presbyterian pastor in Memphis, has done just a fantastic work, wrote a chapter and an article, I believe, on Dabney's relationship to Edwards. And Sean Michael Lucas has written an entire book on Dabney. And he said religious affections was, quote unquote, too anatomical. He said it was too, quote unquote, impractical. One fellow Southerner was commenting on how much Dabney loathed Edwards and said that Dabney, quote unquote, cuts up Edwardsism by the roots. And I mean, if someone's going to say that religious affections is too anatomical, and it is, I guess, from one perspective, you have the mind and the heart and the will. But in that religion, heartfelt, authentic, genuine Christianity is anatomical. Jesus renews our mind. He changes our heart. And so that says more about Dabney, I think, than it does about Edwards. I think Dabney he loved two things, order and tradition, which is why he loved the Westminster Confession and he loved chattel slavery. Then you had James Henley Thornwell, who was a president of the University of South Carolina. He believed that Edwards's theology of sin was a quote-unquote mere juggle with words. Thornwell is perhaps most known today as making one of the most famous defenses of slavery in a treatise that he wrote in 1850. And then you have the Assistant Secretary of War for the Confederacy, Albert Bledsoe, who was a former Episcopal priest turned Methodist. He writes one of the most blistering critiques of Edwards in the South ever. Probably the worst critique ever, and it was on Edwards's freedom of the will, and essentially boiled down to one thing. He just didn't think Edwards's concept of freedom, he just said it wasn't free enough, which of course we would expect from a Wesleyan Arminian.
Sure.
So in the South, you just can't help but see that many of these men who are most outspoken in their Confederate ideology are most averse and hostile to Edwards' theology, and I think there's a reason for that. I think ideas like freedom of the will and religious affections and love to being in general and disinterested benevolence and so on, I think they're just conducive to love of neighbor. And I'm not saying these men were not saved, but what's also interesting is that you have Blackburn, Bouch, I forget their first names, but you have a host of Presbyterians in the mountains of East Tennessee where there are no slaves and there are no plantations, and guess what? They love Edwards. I just can't help but see that plantation Christianity, if you will, is just not conducive to Edwards. And so you have in the Methodist and Presbyterian denominations, you have this resistance to Edwards' ideas, but then you have the Baptists. Baptists seem to be the only group in the South collectively who are able to reconcile Edwards' theology with pro-slavery ideology, which is a really interesting point of history.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure we could explore that quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it seems like an entire project worth.
And I want to add,
addressing.
I don't have time to do it justice, but James P. Boyce studies under Hodge. The only reason, I mean, this changes the entire trajectory of Southern Baptist history, but the only reason that Boyce and Basil Manley Jr. go to Princeton and study under Hodge is because, and we know this, one, because of Basil Manley Jr. writes to his dad and writes a letter where, Jr., for instance, went to Newton Theological Seminary, which is right there by Andover. He went to, he asked John Dagg where to go, and John Dagg was like, go over there. But they were abolitionists. Mm-hmm. And they were, imagine you are growing up on a plantation and you own slaves and then you go to an abolitionist seminary. Mm-hmm. And he writes to his dad and he's like, Dad, these people think we're reprobates. Mm-hmm. And most scholars know that in the antebellum period, Princeton is virtually the only Ivy League school that is accepting of slave owners. Mm. And they don't support it. But people like Hodge, even Hodge has got a weird relationship to slavery. You go up to Harvard and Yale, they almost don't even want to stomach a slave owner in their class. But Princeton will put up with them. Mm. And think about how that changes the course of Southern Baptist history, because now you have Boyce and Jr., instead of studying under Edwardseans, they go up to Princeton, they study under Hodge, they get that confessionalist Christianity, and what do? They come back, and as history would have it, they are the ones who start the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Mm. Think about if you had men like Richard Furman or Jonathan Maxey or Basil Manley Sr. Imagine if they were the ones who started Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. You do have John Dagg's Manual of Theology, which is the first systematic theology that's taught at Southern Seminary. So you have Edwardsian ideas. William B. Johnson, the very first Southern Baptist Convention president, who holds to the moral governmental theory of atonement. He's on a board. He's helping determine the curriculum. So you've got Edwardsians there. But that's one of the reasons I think that James Boyce never really delivers a blistering critique like the Southern Methodists and Southern Presbyterians. I think that he adopts Hodge's appreciation of Edwards, but it's more hesitance. Yeah. Boyce never adopts a Dabney-like hatred. Yeah. So as a result, I think, as history would have it, Southern Baptists are always amenable to Edwards, but they're never, they accept Edwards, whereas I think Southern religious groups were more averse. Mm.
So you write that Northerners, that New England theology, so we're talking about New Divinity now, cross the Mason-Dixon line along two primary routes. First is Northerners who migrated to the South, and the second is Southerners who read the works of Edwards and his New England disciples. So tell me a little bit more about how, and you mentioned some names already, but how this New Divinity shaped Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
You kind of gave a hypothetical, like, imagine if, like...
Yeah.
How, in fact, what was the result?
Well, let's start in the North. New Divinity theology you can lose your job in the North in a Baptist church if you're promoting too much New Divinity theology. The pastor of First Baptist Church of New York City resigns or gets fired essentially because of New Divinity theology. it is controversial. In the South, you don't necessarily lose your job, but if you're cranking out too much moral governmental theory, if you're playing around, we don't have too much time to get into moral governmental theory. But part of that doctrine, even though I do believe it is a species of penal substitution, they reject the idea that the atonement is an exchange. Mm-hmm. They don't believe that Jesus is giving you his righteousness and you're giving. There's none of that theology. Instead, they have this idea that Jesus just, with his blood, he suffers, instead of suffering under the law, he just suffers the equivalent of the law, and he satisfies general justice and basically allows you to come to him by faith and be pardoned. But one of the key departures of moral governmental theory from traditional orthodoxy is that it starts to play around with the idea of imputation. And there is a professor at Furman Academy in the 1840s named James Mims who gets put on trial for heresy because he rejects it, but he keeps his job. So there's this, and the people that put him on trial, they're Edwardseans too. Mm-hmm. So that just testifies to the breadth of the Edwardsian tradition in the South, that you have Edwardseans challenging other Edwardseans. It's like basically they're fighting for the legacy of Edwards. And you also have like people like Jesse Hartwell. Jesse Hartwell went out to Alabama in what is now Samford University, and he gets under suspicion a little bit because he believes in moral governmental theory and he rejects the traditional idea of imputation, and he is almost fired. So to answer your question, if the new divinity is always like, the Southern Baptists love the idea of disinterested benevolence. They love it. Richard Fuller, the third president of the Southern Baptist Convention, he loves disinterested benevolence. Richard Furman did. It's everywhere. John Dagg, but they're not really down with like willing to be damned for the glory of God. Like, you just don't see that. That's New England theology type stuff. So if you're espousing that from a Southern Baptist pulpit, you ain't gonna have a job very long. So within reason, they're taking ideas from the new divinity and of course Fuller, but there are limits. And I think Jonathan Maxey, who is the very first president of South Carolina College, he is and was the most influential new divinity man in the South. He came straight from New England. He was a Federalist. He was a New England. He was a New Englander through and through. He was really bright, and he shaped all of these men who ended up founding the Southern Baptist Convention. And so he gave them an appreciation for people like Hopkins and Jonathan Edwards Jr. and Timothy Dwight. So new divinity did come down over the Mason-Dixon line, and it either came through a book or sometimes it came through a classroom. And then people like Basil Manley Sr. were left to choose which facet of the Edwardsian tradition they wanted to hold to. And sometimes it was like, hey, I'm just going to read Edwards, and I'm going to read Nature, True Virtue, and I'm just going to leave this Hopkinsian stuff over here. And I think that's kind of what we're doing today. Think about it. With this resurgence that we're having in Edwards studies today, and by that I mean like young Reformed and Restless. How many young Reformed and Restless guys do you know who are reading Samuel Hopkins's God's Glory? What was that book that he read? Just how many young Reformed Restless guys do you know who are reading Jonathan Edwards Jr.? Yeah, it just doesn't translate. Don't
even know his name.
That's right. That's right. So that's kind of how new divinity theology came down past the Ohio River, past the Mason-Dixon line. But one part of the book that I think that I hoped would be a new contribution is I don't think people realize just how influential Timothy Dwight was. Timothy Dwight was not a thoroughgoing new divinity man. He was an Edwardsian. He was Edwards's grandson, But he kind of steered clear of some of the more extreme doctrines, and because of that, his systematic theology was really popular among Southern Baptists.
So if we talk about Edwardsian theology in the South, we have to talk about his relationship to slaveholding and the relationship between his theology and slaveholding. So it's well known, obviously, Edwards was a slaveholder. But in what ways was his theology used, so not Edwards himself, but what ways was his theology used to either support slavery on the one hand or bolster the abolitionist cause on the other hand? And a slightly related question, I think sort of big picture, how can it be that somebody's theology can be used to support two very divergent views, which are just radically different?
I think, first of all, no one in the South is making a defense of slavery and like whipping out their religious affections. Nobody's like, Edwards said this, you know. I think that if you had to pinpoint one idea that was most significant in the mind of the slaveholder, it was probably the idea that that Jesus' death was not just for the glory of God, but was for the greatest possible good. And Edwards bequeaths this idea to a lot of Southern Baptists and Edwardsians too. You see this a ton in John Dagg when John Dagg makes his famous defense of slavery. Southern Edwardsians, pro-slavery Edwardsians are really staunchly convinced that everything they do must be for the greatest possible good. And so I think that where you see ideas at play is you see Edwardsians in the North saying, no, we believe that Christ died for all, and since we believe that Christ died for all, we want that Christ died for the greatest possible good in his moral universe, and that means everyone should be free. And then you have Southern Edwardsians taking that idea and they'll go, no, slavery is for the greatest possible good. Because if slaves were allowed to be free, then they're not educated. They're not, they would say racist things like they're not educated. They're not really, they wouldn't know what to do with freedom if they had it. And they would harm themselves, and they wouldn't know how to contribute to a moral society or a moral universe, and therefore it would not be for the greatest possible good. Therefore, having slavery in a white society is for the greatest possible good because we're bettering our society and we're bettering them because now we're bringing them over to our white society where they're receiving education and morals that they never would in Africa. I mean, can you see that kind of ideology at play there? So it's amazing people think of slave-owning society as this barbaric, Dark Ages type civilization, and it was that in many ways, but we have to remember that one of the reasons I wrote this book was to show that slave-owning theologians are not dummies. They're cosmopolitan. They take ideas. They're reading Edwards. I mean, they're reading European thinkers. I mean, and they take that idea of the Jesus dying for the greatest good of the moral universe, and they uphold this idea that that what they're doing is not only honorable, but that it's for the good of the slave. Mm-hmm. I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize is they were concerned with goodness, and they believed that they were being good. Mm-hmm. And the other idea I would say is
to sort of summarize that, would it be sort of an adoption of Edwards' history of redemption, like that sort of understanding of here's where redemption is going, and this is a stage.
Ooh, I didn't think
on
about
that storyline.
I'm not sure if it would be.
Maybe not explicitly that, but
I mean,
sort of the logic.
Think about the underlying idea. There's two underlying concepts in virtually everything that Edwards writes. And it is that God works all things for his own glory, and God works all things for the good of his people. That's in Edwards. That we take that for granted sometimes, but I don't think you get that kind of. You don't get those two ideas really as much in the writings of, well, say a Charles Hodge. Think about the moral governmental theory of atonement. It's predicated on the idea that Christ did not just die for the honor of the law; he died for the good of his moral universe. So to answer your question, I think that Southern Edwardsians took this idea of God working all things for his glory and the good of his people. I think it bred this almost utilitarian view of, well, we're going to do the most good for the most people. Slavery must be the most good for the most people, so it must work and it must be right because it's God's will. They also had this idea of honor. I think New Divinity in the North, they had a view of honor that was moral. You didn't have honor unless you had morality. You didn't have honor unless you had ethics, unless you were virtuous, unless you were disinterested. Southern society, if you had honor, it just means you had more authority. And can you see that? How ethics in the New Divinity, disinterested benevolence drives this idea of, well, if I'm going to be honorable, I had to be a good person. Whereas in Southern society, it's more patriarchal and more, no, if I'm going to have honor, it means I have this station or this I'm going to occupy this position over these many people. Yeah. So I think that, this. And what does the Bible say to the slave owner or a slave to the slave? Pay honor to the slave master. So they loved that verse. So I would say that tinkering with the concept of honor, which is all over Edwards. Edwards talks about honor, the honor of the law. Christ died for the honor of the law. But I think most, and rather than pulling from text and verse from an Edwards source, I think that Southern Edwardsians are eaten up with this idea that God is for them, and since God is for them and Christ has died for them, that God works all things for his glory and for the good of his people. Therefore, slavery is for the good of the slave, good for them, and it is for his glory. These are not people who are embarrassed about being slave owners. Yeah. And you see this in Furman, too. Richard Furman writes one of the very first, if not the very first, religious defense of slavery in 1823, and he does it on behalf of the South Carolina Baptists, which is embarrassing. And one of his central things is we're promoting human happiness. But in that work, Furman cites moral government. He cites the divine government. And he does it because in the wake of the Nat Turner slave revolt, South Carolina is a tinderbox, and people are afraid that the basically all the slaves in South Carolina are going to revolt against them and kill them in their sleep. And that's why Furman pins that. Furman is convinced that order and structure to society is the essence of divine government. So he equates divine government and order in white society. Yeah. So
on the flip side, maybe you can just kind of briefly share what are the ideas behind Edwards' theology, which get parsed out and developed in different ways by the New Divinity, that are used against slaveholding.
One of them, I think, is
thrown out a couple of key terms already, so maybe you could just define those. Or
can you imagine, Chris? Can you imagine Can you imagine how revolutionary the idea of natural ability can be in the 19th century, in the early 19th century. Think about it. I mean, we today think of natural ability. We're like, yeah, it makes sense. I guess we're dead in our sins. We don't have the ability to come to God, but we're not like, we're still humans. We're still, we parse that out. We think about it philosophically. We're like, yeah, that makes sense. But think about it in a world where there are an entire class of human beings who are treated as if they're lesser than human beings, and then you start throwing around the idea that they have natural ability. Slave owners don't want that, which is why I think that it is not a coincidence that confessionalist, Confederate, pro-slavery Calvinists, they don't like natural ability. You don't see them tinkering around with that idea. You do see the new divinity, though. And why is that? I mean, when Edwards wrote Freedom of the Will, he parsed out that distinction. Of course, he's not thinking about slaves. He's thinking about revival. He's thinking about people using their human responsibility to come to God. But I don't think we've stopped to really consider, and you see this in the Beecher family. I'm writing a book right now on the Beechers. Lyman Beecher is all about some New Haven theology, and he loves natural ability. And what do you see his kids, and Charles Finney at the same time, really, who is also a staunch abolitionist, but his kids take that idea and they go they become theological liberals, and they become very outspoken abolitionists. So to answer your question, I don't think scholars have given much attention, or as much attention as they should, to the idea that the concept of natural ability, the doctrine of natural ability, that humans have inherent within them the ability to come to God, to know God, and to live a righteous life. It applies to blacks. It applies to slaves. And that idea doesn't happen overnight, but the evolution of that idea, I believe, and I believe we see it in history, starts to take hold in the abolitionist mind. And that's one of the reasons we see abolitionism starting in New England. So something to think about. And we'll think about freedom of the will.
Yeah.
Okay, so you tell a slave they have the freedom of the will, but they don't have the freedom to, I just think that's, I just think that this is why Edwards was a slaveholder. Obviously, he did denounce the international slave trade, but it is undeniable that Edwards's ideas just, they unleash abolitionism upon New England. Now, I'm not saying William Lloyd Garrison. I mean, he was more of a Quaker. I'm not saying that every abolitionist was influenced by Edwards, but what I'm saying is Edwards's ideas, and as powerful as we know that tradition was, it becomes just an ideological arsenal behind the abolitionist movement.
Maybe this is too big of a question, which will force you into an exaggeration, so you don't have to answer it. Do you think without Edwards's theology, the abolitionist movement would have been as successful as it was in the U.S.?
Well,
or is he just one piece?
Yeah, he's one piece because there's a lot of men. I would say that the most significant contribution that Edwards makes to the abolitionist movement, and my Calvinist buddies don't want to hear this, and my Southern Baptist buddies really don't either, and Michael Horton over in
just down the freeway
doesn't want to hear this either, but it's Charles Finney. Charles Finney and his New Measures Revivalism, as poorly constructed as it is theologically speaking, is laced with abolitionist thought and sentiment, and wherever his New Measures Revivalism is, ultimately the seeds of abolitionism grow. And what does Oberlin become under Finney? It becomes a machine for anti-slavery. Now, Finney at times, he had people who worshiped him. Ohio is just, I mean, Ohio in the 1840s and 50s is just a seedbed for abolitionism. Just Yankees coming over. That's why Southerners stopped at Kentucky. Southern Ohio was kind of, but that's why Cincinnati, you have Lyman Beecher coming in. I mean, Southern Ohio, Harry Beecher Stowe starts getting those ideas for Uncle Tom's Cabin in Cincinnati. Ohio is just filled with Edwardseans. And Finneyism, we don't have too much time to get into it. Beecher pretty much loses half his students at Lane because he doesn't want to take a stand against slavery. But Finney, he says, let's go. Now, he always does maintain that his priority is to saving souls first. And some of his lesser spiritual or lesser religious disciples kind of disagree with him on that, and they become radicals. But I would say Edwards's, or at least one of Edwards's chief legacies to the history of abolitionism is through Charles Finney. There's a guy named Theodore Dwight Weld. I don't know if he's named after Dwight or not. That man he was like John the Baptist with the American Anti-Slavery Society. He went around back roads everywhere and just recruited people against abolitionism. And he was a diehard Finneyite. He thought Charles Finney hung the moon.
For abolitionism.
For abolitionism.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So to answer your point, no, because William Lloyd Garrison, I don't know what he thinks of Edwards. I know he read Edwards, but I think he's more Quaker. But I think that from non-heretics, for the orthodox side of abolitionism, Edwards gives, I don't know that you would really have a strong orthodox ideology, anti-slavery ideology without Edwards.
Yeah. So just to kind of wrap things up, thinking about our audience, which includes Edwards scholars and also seminarians who are not focused on Edwards, why should they take the time to study his influence on Baptists or Southern theology or even just American theology?
That's a really good question. I want to take the more kind of relevant 21st century approach and say we're going through a moment right now where we're grappling with the aftermath of the Young Reformed and Restless movement. I mean, we are. I mean, I don't know if you claim to be a part of that or what that had upon you, but I know I was a part of it. I was a Piper guy. I still am a Piper guy. Maybe not like diehard Piper like I was, but let's face it, we've been shaped by.
We were all young.
Yeah, that's what we're going through right now. This cultural moment we're in, we all got hyped up for Calvinism. Some of us too zealously, and now the Calvinist movement has kind of fractured because now politics has got it, and now those Calvinist buddies of ours who we thought were like really down with God's sovereignty, now they're like just like diehard like Trumpists, and we're like, okay, or they're just people. They just seem to like they can't love their neighbor, or they're just so divisive. And so now you have politics thrown in and kind of fracturing what was the Young Reformed and Restless movement and social issues, things like that. And I think there's a temptation right now to look back and go, it was fake. It was just emotions. All of us reading Edwards, and that's, read Colin Hansen's book, which is where we got the title. Colin Hansen devotes a lot of that book to Edwards. Jesus is my homeboy mug, all that kind of stuff. I think there's a temptation for us right now to look back and go, was that real, or was that me just being mad at my Armenian pastor? And I think that this book and the idea of Edwards influencing so many generation of Baptists can tell you that it's not fake. I'm not saying that Edwards is the key to genuine, authentic Christianity. What I am saying is that Baptists today are just like Baptists for the last 200 years, and they are reading Edwards, not because they believe that Edwards is supreme above the Word of God, but they see in Edwards the same thing that their theological forebears did, which is if you are a Baptist today, you are more than likely interested in heartfelt, pious, affectionate Christianity, and that's exactly what Jonathan Edwards is writing about. So I think that to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think you should read about the history of Jonathan Edwards and Baptists as a reminder that in the providence of God, Jonathan Edwards has spoken into the lives of so many Baptists and continues to do so. And our interest with Edwards, however it comes about, whether we call it Young Reformed Restless, whether we call it TGC, whether we call it T4G, whatever we call it, it's just another form of what's been taking place for the last 200 years, which is Baptists kind of like Edwardsean theology. So I think that's one thing that this can do is just, hey, we're a part of something, and it's just Baptists being interested in a brand of theology that lends itself to the religion in the heart.
Yeah. So just as we wrap things up, what's next for you in the world of Edwards, and maybe what are some resources that you might point our audience to?
Resources, I would point to the book that started me off on this whole thing, which is Ian Murray. I think it's still a great book. Banner of Truth, go get it. It's very cheap, unlike my book, which costs $160. George Marsden's book for people who want to go deeper. I would really encourage people to read Doug Sweeney's works. Oliver Crisp is just a brilliant mind. Every time I read him, I'm like, oh, gosh, I wish I could think like him. I also think there's things coming out about Edwardseans like Charles Finney. I think there's a great book by Charles Hambrick Stowe on Charles Finney and American evangelicalism. Whether you like Finney or don't, Charles Finney's a fascinating figure who's contributed a lot, and he believed that Edwards gave him all his ideas. Now, would Edwards have believed that? I'm not sure. So I would encourage people to read biographies of Edwards and biographies of Edwards' disciples. My work, I am coming out with a book in August by LSU Press. It's called The Beechers, American Influencers. Mark Knoll has been kind enough to agree to write the foreword for that book. I just got a little blurb from Dr. Sweeney on the back. I'm trying to get a big one that I don't know if they're gonna email me back. I was actually checking my phone this afternoon to see if they had, and they hadn't. But I'm really proud of it. Edwards comes up a ton in the book. If you're going to do a book on the Beechers, Edwards can't be left out. And so that's coming out in August with LSU Press, and I'm really proud of it. It's also the biggest book I've ever written. And then I am beginning a project, very beginning. I sent in a proposal the other day, and it's a new project. It has nothing to do with Edwards, and it has more to do with 19th century Baptists. And so that's in kind of beta stage. But I'm just, right now, people ask me what I'm writing on or where I'm kind of interested, and really my interests are whatever I think is really worth writing about. And the good news about American religious history is it's just so wide open. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just so much to learn and so much to read. And if you've got the time and you want to commit yourself and research and write, I think you can get published and you can still do great work. I mean, there's so much in American religious history other than Edwards to write on. And I'm going to keep doing it as long as I can.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Obbie, for spending the time with us. And thank you to our audience for taking the time to listen to the Jonathan Edwards Center podcast. I invite you to join us next time as we dive more into Edwardsean scholarship.
Thanks for having me, man.